Well, let's hear from the member for Wentworth now, the independent MP Allegra Spender, on this particular topic. We'll get to others later. Allegra, good morning. We've spoken about housing so often. I mean, it's an interesting point that Sydney being hollowed out at the moment as talent moves to other cities. I mean, in all the discussions, I hadn't really heard that point before, despite all the pluses that Sydney has. I mean, do you fear that we will lose the best of the city in the years to come if housing affordability isn't addressed?
I think they're absolutely right. And, you know, you think of who those best and brightest, those young people who have new skills, who are growing skills, some from overseas, but some, you know, born straight here in Australia. And they're the ones that are so critical to retain in Sydney, but they're the ones who are going to be pushed out. Because if you bought a house, you know, 10, 15, 20 years ago, you know, you're in a much better position if you're a young person who's trying to, you know, who's still renting or, you know, or bought a house in the last couple of years. It's become completely unaffordable.
Yeah,
and so I completely agree with the City of Sydney. Yeah. The Committee for Sydney on this. Does
it surprise you, though, that Sydney is number two? I mean, your electorate is one of, if not the wealthiest electorates in the country. Does it surprise you that it's so bad, Sydney, where it is right now, number two in the world behind Hong Kong?
Well, look, to be honest, it really feels like that. If you talk to people in my community, you know, my community, as you know, has some areas which are, as you say, quite wealthy. But then I think there are other areas. We have 45% of my community rents, and they are really feeling the housing biting right now. And I had a young man in my office just the other day, and he said, "Look, I think I've done everything right. I've studied hard. I finished uni. I've got a 50,000 HECS debt. You know, I've got a good job, and I just have no idea if I'm ever going to be able to own my own home." And that's a generational shift. In, you know, 30, 40 years ago, he would be sitting pretty. He would be on the right trajectory, but he just isn't anymore. And we have found that generation, and we absolutely need to address it.
Well, the answer is build, build, build. I mean, we've spoken about this before. You've said that's what needs to happen. But I mean, do you think that there is a will to do that at the moment? Chris Minns is going to be talking about this a little bit later.
Look, you know, what I'm really pleased to see is that the federal government has now some harder incentives for the states. So they've put, I think, $2.5 billion incentives to say, look, you know, we want you, the states, to build and get zoning right. But, you know, you'll only get the money if you actually do the building. And I think that's absolutely critical, because we've heard platitudes of, yes, we'll get there in terms of supply, but until we absolutely see that delivery, it's not going to make a real difference to people's lives. So I want to see that, but we also need stronger protections for renters, because renters, you know, are an increasing part of our population. You know, 50% of single families are renters, and so those are people who are really looking for stability in their rental. But you know, we don't have a culture of really protecting our renters in this country.
Let's get to Catherine King. Allegra, she's under a huge storm cloud at the moment over that Qatar decision. She said this morning, last hour, it was her call. Colleagues were consulted without naming them, and wouldn't single out all the reasons for stopping these extra flights. I mean, is that good enough in the interests of transparency?
Look, I think a lot of people are really concerned about this, and not least, you know, airfares, some of the airfares are up 50%. And if you're trying to reunite with, you know, friends and family overseas after, you know, COVID, you know, it's absolutely a crippling, you know, cost of living issue for many people. And so I think the confusion has been, well, what are the reasons? We've heard, you know, 4 or 5 different reasons for 4 or 5 different ministers. So I think it's great that we are doing an inquiry. I'd like to get some transparency on this, because it's a decision that really affects people's lives, and so people want to really understand the justification for it.
So with that said, I mean, is the performance of the Transport Minister, is that good enough up until this point?
Look, I think that these are the questions that we want really transparency on, and I don't think the government has given us transparency.
I mean, James Patterson said last hour, it's probably Stephen Jones who slipped up by telling the truth recently, that it was essentially done to protect Qantas's profits. Do you agree with him?
Look, I mean, that certainly sounds like it. You know, it's to come that from a government minister is a bit extraordinary. That would be a reason why they contemplate this. But to be honest, we just don't know what are the reasons, and that's what I think most of the Australian people are just seeking. We just want to know. We just want to justify it, because it makes a real difference to people's lives, and so they want to know, you know, why this decision was taken.
Allegra Spender, good to chat. We'll talk to you soon.